Okay, so today we're going to talk about biofiltration in your greenhouse technology class. Last week we talked about sort of mechanical filtration and chemical treatment for water, and this is more of the sort of biological, uh, more natural approach, let's say. So why do we bother filtering, right? So this is kind of a bit of review from last week. Obviously, we want to prevent disease, which means killing pathogens in our water. And ideally, we are recirculating our water, right? That's the goal. We want to minimize water consumption. And the Ministry of the Environment, if you end up working in Ontario, has a no discharge, right? So that's a no discharge. Never mind. I can't write to save my life with a mouse. Anyways, the other reason we filter is to prevent mechanical blockages, right? Blocking drippers. So when we get algae or biofilm buildup in our pipes, those slough off and plug things. So we need to be able to remove those sorts of things. And then if we do absolutely have to release water from the farm into the environment, we have to prevent nutrient loss. So that's called effluent mitigation. That's the fancy term. But really what we're trying to do is we're trying to minimize nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium from getting out into the environment, causing all sorts of algae problems and polluting the water. So that's what we filter. When it comes to biofiltration, we rely on bacteria and fungi and protozoa to do the work. So if you remember some of your compost lessons and soil biology lessons from plant science 2, you'll recall some of these things like flagellates, paramecium, bacteria, fungi like streptomyces. These are all beneficial organisms that will remove contaminants from your water. So on top of that, they consume nutrients. So it's not just contaminants in terms of biological contaminants, but they also, by growing, actually consume nitrogen and phosphorus and things like that. Um, but they are an essential component to a biological system, right? Um, some of the species that are documented that they're able to kill are really critical, right? So you were looking at things like Phytophthora, Pythium, Fusarium, Erwinia. These should be ringing a bell, right? You may not be familiar with Verticillia. That's more of a nursery thing with trees, especially maple trees. Xanthomonas, we've talked briefly about that one time. Those things are all controlled by biofilters. So that's fantastic. We can reduce root zone pathogens. That's fantastic. Um, they're not all biofilters are equally as effective at removing macronutrients, so we do have to be aware of that. Um, and in order for bacteria to grow, we do need to make sure we have a carbohydrate source, right? So something for them to eat. Either you have lots of organic biofilm that feeds the bacteria, but otherwise you need to supply something. So wood chips are very popular for that. I've seen coir, lots of different substrates. You'll see on the slides, even waste products from processing like peanut shells have been used. Um, Really, there's any number of things that are plant-based waste could be used, and you're looking for something that takes quite a while to break down. Otherwise, you have to constantly dig out your filter and replace them. But not all systems use carbohydrates, and so we have to be mindful that they may struggle to remove nutrients. They may just remove pathogens. All right, so other limitations, uh, they all have different capacities. So we're talking, your liters per hour, how much water can it treat, right? So they all have different sizes. They take up space. Um, the microorganisms also take time. They don't just instantaneously remove bacteria. It's it's a uh, it's a time-consuming process. So that also indicates the size of the unit. So if the surface area and what's the load in your water, if you have a low bacterial load, you can get away with a smaller biofilter. If you have a higher bacterial load, you need a bigger biofilter. These things get complicated and they're beyond the scope of what we're trying to cover in this lesson. But you should be aware that you have to match the filter to your biological load. The other thing is microorganisms need warmth. There's certain temperatures that are required in order for them to function, right? So in the winter, if it's freezing and your system's outside, it's not going to work. So is your farm seasonal, right? So different systems are applicable to different farms, right? So nurseries are growing in the summer months, so it's not a problem to have an outdoor biofilter. Whereas a year-round growing facility would have to have either one in the ground that's sufficiently warm so it doesn't freeze, or it has to have one built inside the farm, which might look very different. So that comes into play when you're talking about space. So those are important considerations. Then there's the lifespan of the biofilter. Each biofilter technology has its own consumable elements. So things like wetlands, they can last for a very long time, tens of years on that scale. Once they're built correctly, in theory, they last a very, very long time. They shouldn't have to take it apart. Media filters, the media, depending on the type of media, can last anywhere from 5 to 10 years, and then it starts to break down. Biochip filters, which rely on the media being consumed, like wood chips, they are up to 10 years, which is not bad. That's pretty long. It's astonishing how long they last. But again, depending on how much biological load and how much activity and all those other things, the temperature of your climate, they all impact how long it lasts. So we're going to go over these different types of biofilters today. We're going to talk about media biofilters, anaerobic biodigesters or wood chip filters, artificial wetlands, vegetated field strips, hybrid treatment systems, and land application. So let's dig right in. So media biofilters rely on these sort of plastic or biological widgets. They're usually plastic. And if you look, this is what we have in our college aquaponics system. If you look carefully, there's all kinds of structure, which makes for lots of surface area because this ends up being all covered with bacteria. So we need something that will support bacteria on a large surface area. A lot of the organisms, Paramecium, Verticillium, whatnot, Vorticella, they actually anchor onto a structure. Even amoeba, they don't like to float. They usually crawl on a surface or attach to a surface. So in order to support those beneficial organisms, we want a large surface area so we can support a lot of those microorganisms. And then we'll have more bacterial growth and more consumption of pathogens and nutrients, right? So in this particular tank here, it is full of plastic thingamabobs. I'm not even sure what the proper term is. Bio balls, I've seen them called. They're just that plastic structure. It's full of them, right? And water is percolating through at a fairly slow pace and allowing the bacteria in the tank to do its job, and then it's pumped out and reused. I'm not going to say every hydroponic vegetable grower uses these sorts of things, but quite a few do. I know like a very large cucumber grower up in Waterdown and another one in Flamborough uses them. They're not everywhere. I like them. I think that it's pretty cheap to put in and it's a nice insurance. They still use a downstream filtration like UV and stuff like that. But this reduces the load on that and improves the just their overall usefulness of the system. So I think they're really good. In a media filter, it's important to understand that oxygen levels decrease as you move down the column. Oxygen plays a role in denitrification, right? So this particular indoor one, it's not very large. The water's not in there for that long. You're not going to see a lot of nutrient denitrification. But in the context of a recirculating hydroponic farm, we're reusing the nutrients anyways. We're not discharging them, so it's not that relevant. But if you were to use this system in an ornamental farm that's not recirculating or wants to discharge, this would be insufficient because it doesn't have enough of an aerobic condition to remove the nitrogen completely. So it wouldn't be a solution in and of itself in that context. Here's a closer picture of some of the systems that are out there. These are complex three-dimensional screens that are dumped into the bins. Then there's plastic, any kind of design you want to come up with. Basically, the common theme is they have lots of surface area. And then there's peanut shells I talked about with media, although this would be more based in a biofilter context. And then there's sponges, very high surface area. So it's interesting to see all the different strategies. This is inside a hydroponic farm that's using a lot of media filters to treat their water. So these would each be absolutely full of those convoluted plastic structures to create a huge biofilm.
Hi, I'm Ann Huber from the Soil Resource Group. We are now here at a flower greenhouse in the Niagara region, standing on a wood chip biofilter. This RAMI project is to look at the removal of plant pathogens from greenhouse runoff water through this system. The bed that you see is approximately 20 by 50 feet. Underneath a thin layer of gravel there's about 7 feet of wood chips, and this is designed to remove nitrogen. The smaller trays here are layers of slag over peat, and the slag is designed to remove phosphorus from the runoff water. This system has been operating for 5 years. Since then, we have been monitoring the effectiveness of the system to remove nitrogen and phosphorus. For the RAMI project, we are also looking at how effective the system is at removing plant pathogens so that the grower can then reuse the water and recycle it back into his irrigation water system. For the project, we are sampling as the water comes out of the greenhouse, as it goes on to the denitrification biofilter, and as it comes out of the treatment system, we can sample here, and the end product then goes into the pond. Over the 5 years that we've been sampling, we have found that the system is performing extremely well. It's removing over 95% of the nitrogen, also about 60% of the phosphorus, and we have found that is extremely effective at removing the plant pathogens.
Moving on to artificial wetlands, I've got some pictures here. These are discharge pipes where your wastewater would be percolated out over the wetland, and then it would move through the wetland and be fed on by plants and microorganisms to clean it. These are pretty good, but they take up quite a bit of space. This is a beautiful, nice architectural wetland beside 2 ponds. It's well established. They can look really astounding. This is a new one here. You can see the plants are very small. This has only just been installed. This is at a greenhouse in Niagara. Anyways, so they're typically constructed of sand and gravel that has soil and a cloth layer on top. So the soil creates the layer that plants can live in. If you look carefully, this actually has gravel on top. So there's a gravel layer and then cloth and then soil and cloth. So they're trying to mitigate evaporation, and also the gravel reflects sunlight in the summer, so it keeps the water a little cooler because it hasn't fully established. So that's an interesting construction approach. But typically you've got soil, this is a soil-based one, on top with a ground cloth, and below that is where your media is, right? Where your biofiltration happens. So that down below is where the rocks and sand are layered to create your biofiltration. Where the top layer, where the plants are growing, their roots are actually consuming nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So they're effective at removing both nutrients and pathogens. There is the risk of water loss because of transpiration and evaporation, right? So these are outdoors and exposed to the elements, and so there is definitely evaporation happening. So you're not getting all your water back. So if you're in a water reduced climate, these may or may not be your best solution. This is just a cross section of a constructed wetland showing your pond. Maybe this is where you've got a low-lying area where there's actually water lilies. This layer may or may not be full of water. Typically not, I would say. Then you've got your mulch, your soil, a boundary layer, and then your sand, and maybe even wood chips below that, where you get your denitrification and your biofiltration happening. And then below that, the water's collected off and sent into the next pond where it's retained for use. So constructed wetlands are pretty cool. I've got a video on that as well.
Hi, I'm Ann Huber and this is Lloyd Rosema. We're at a Niagara greenhouse. The grower at this greenhouse has decided to eliminate all his leachate discharge and reuse all the nutrients by running it through a constructed wetland. The grower has decided to move to a 3-stage constructed wetland. The partners on this WAMKE project are Omafra and Ag Canada, Lloyd Rosema Aqua Treatment Technologies. We are, besides looking at nutrient removal and solids removal in the wetland, the WAMKE funding enables us to also examine pathogen removal from the water.
In the past, the aqua wetland system has been used to treat many different types of wastewater. However, now that we're treating the greenhouse leachate water, it's important to do some sampling to demonstrate the efficacy of the constructed wetland. All of the irrigation leachate water is collected in a pump that's located out of doors. The water from this sump is then applied into this coarse screen filter. This screen filter removes all of the peat moss and some of the larger particles prior to its application to the constructed wetland. The water from the sump is poured onto the Bose screen filter. As the water moves down over the filter, the peat moss is separated from the water stream. This peat moss ends up into a bin, and the water ends up and is treated a little bit further via cloth filter in the next step. So water from the coarse screen filter enters this pump tank. This pump tank then applies the water to cell 1 of the 3-cell constructed wetland. What's unique about this site is the majority of the leachate production at this facility occurs from the fall throughout the winter due to the grower's choice of crops, which is cut tulips and poinsettias. So for this reason, we've had to go with a vertical flow constructed wetland, which is capable of operating year-round. Water from the bottom of the previous cell is collected into this pump chamber. From this pump chamber, it's pumped onto the top of the next cell via a distribution manifold. During summer, this manifold is a surface manifold. During winter, we utilize a subsurface manifold, and this helps keep the system running year-round. A typical distribution manifold consists of 2-inch headers with 3/4-inch laterals. These laterals consist of holes drilled evenly spaced along the top, and this allows for even distribution of the water over top of the cell. The principle of this vertical flow wetland technology is that we have buried winter distribution manifolds and surface summertime distribution manifolds. So seasonally we have to change the manifolds to run. So this can be simply accomplished by closing one manifold and opening the other to winter.
The grower is very happy with the system. It retains nutrients for reuse and returns water of high quality for reuse. The grower has achieved his objectives of zero discharge of leachate, recovery of nutrients, and return of high quality water into the greenhouse for reuse.
Okay, I've had some audio difficulties with the first video. Hopefully that last video worked. Just out of interest, this is the largest constructed wetland in the world. It is massive. It's built in Oman, and it's used to treat runoff water from oil fields. Just looking at it, I'm wondering if this is where the dirty water first enters. Seems to be struggling a little bit, but anyways, that's pretty wild. I don't know if you can see the scale of this, right? It's massive. Mind-boggling. Okay, so moving on from the constructed wetland, there is another system called a hybrid treatment system. So this is sort of like, think of a constructed wetland that's raised up and the plants and soil are not there. It's just exposed. So it's non-vegetated. Uh, it does have both organic and inorganic media filter types. You're looking at, this is actually coconut husks chopped. This is more of a tropical climate. But it could be any sort of media. So it's very similar to the media biofilter or even like the wood chip biofilter. I mean, these are all variations on the same theme, right? The idea is that you have a large pit, you percolate your water through these trunks down through the media where your biological activity does its thing. The variation, of course, is that this is using media type filter out in the open, but it's not covered with gravel and slag like a biochip filter. One of the challenge here, of course, would be year-round use. It's not insulated, unlike that wetland filter we looked at in the video where it was able to discharge below the frost line or above the frost line, depending on the time of year. This is very primitive. So this is a low-cost solution, really, right? You see these, and they are built for nurseries and golf courses. Golf courses are particularly bad at nutrient discharge. So they may have collection ponds and they'll pump them up through these fields in the back area you don't see to try to mitigate nutrient runoff, trying to meet the new Ministry of the Environment regulations. But of course, this is open, so moisture will evaporate in the summer. So there's a water loss liability. And that is why I say the wood chip biofilter is superior. But also, why? Because the wood chip biofilter collects phosphorus via the slag, right? So there's a couple of reasons why a wood chip biofilter would be superior to this. But not everyone's aware of the technologies that are available. And a wood chip biofilter would cost a little more to construct, potentially. These are low-tech solutions. These are not really for recirculation, but they are in the Flowers Canada recommendations, so I'm including them. This is called a vegetative field strip, where if you have, this is your farm, and you have nutrient runoff or discharge, there is a strip of plant material that intercepts any runoff, and it has to percolate through before it goes into a waterway. There are no engineered structured layers. There's only Mother Nature's approach to biological filtration. Not saying that that can't be effective, like this would perhaps be considered more natural, but at the end of the day, this is going into a waterway. It could be going into your pond, I suppose, for recirculation, but I would be very nervous about the efficacy because the infiltration rate of regular soil is not very good. We're using much coarser materials in these filters, where regular soil, I think, will be overrun when you have a lot of run, right? So if there's a big storm or something like that, and there's a heavy water load, it's going to override it and go right into your water. And you might end up with pathogens in your water. So, you know, the vegetative field strip, not so good. Good at catching sediment and organic matter, right? But in rainstorm conditions, you have escape. Not much evidence that there's degradation of pathogens and pesticides, as I mentioned. But, you know, where I have seen these used is if your pond has an overflow. So if you, in the event that you just can't contain the water coming off your farm anymore, the Ministry of the Environment still considers that water sewage. And so in this case, vegetative field strips are effective insurance in the case of an overflow event. So it's not a regular use filter. It's sort of just in case, like a valve, if there's an overflow from your pond, it has to go through this before it goes into a river or a ditch. So they do have their place. This is a vegetative field strip at an institutional grounds. This is in Ottawa. So here's your, this is actually a catch basin here, and so if it overflows this dike, it has to run through this media filter before it hits the park and goes into obviously some sort of important structure. So that's a vegetative field strip. Land application last. This is for people who have a lot of land and they, have to discharge. So this I've seen this scenario with large vegetable growers, right? So I always say that vegetable growers recirculate all their water. They do, but eventually things get out of whack and they have to dump the water and restart. So, you can either reprocess all the water with reverse osmosis, but even with reverse osmosis, there's some discharge. So, sooner or later, even these ideal scenarios, they will have to discharge. And a lot of farms have quite a bit of land around them. And so, what they do is they apply, this requires a permit, they apply for a one time field discharge. There are strict limits on how many per year, and usually it's only once per year that it's permitted, where they would take their nutrient tank or whatever it is that's out of whack, and say maybe there's an outbreak, like last year Ontario plant propagators had a major problem with canker, and they had to treat all their water, and they couldn't do it, so they had to discharge the entire system and start fresh. So you apply for a permit. The Ministry of the Environment will give you approval. They'll have an on-site inspector, and essentially you take this long pipe and you put it way out into your field, and it just percolates it into the field, and it just naturally goes through the ground. So you need a lot of land in order to do this. It's not something that you can just put onto your backyard. It's got to be a good sized field to meet the requirements. And so obviously the main thing is you cannot exceed the soil infiltration rate. So if you are discharging on the field and it's not percolating into the soil fast enough, it will actually run off the side of the field and it could go into a ditch or a wetland. So part of the application process means that your soil has to be suitable. And so the Ministry of the Environment comes out, checks all these things. It's a big deal. It's obviously, they don't want you doing this regularly, right? So, but in an emergency situation, it can be done. All right, so we've discussed all the different types of biofiltration. So media biofilters, wood chip biofilters, otherwise known as anaerobic, because it's deep and full of water, there's not a lot of oxygen. That's where you get your denitrification. Artificial wetlands or constructed wetlands. We've talked about the vegetable filter strip or vegetative filter strip. Hybrid treatment systems, which is sort of an exposed media filter. And then lastly, land applications. Interestingly, this photograph here is of a septic system for a house. And if you think about it, a lot of what we talked about applies in the sense that your sewage from your house goes down into these discharge pipes. And then there's a gravel bed, which is covered by soil and your grass. And the sewage goes into here. There's an anaerobic environment where the nutrients are consumed. And the biofilm on the gravel consumes any pathogens like E. coli and whatnot. And the water that eventually seeps out of this into the ground is treated. Now, we're not reusing that necessarily, but think about it. A lot of people that have a septic bed have well water. So, they do work. And it is a sort of biofiltration, obviously. So, all right. I hope you found this interesting. See you in class.